Welcome to the Merchant Ship Cree by Mark Van Pelt. Copyright 2017 by Mark Van Pelt. All rights reserved. Dedications. The Merchant Ship Cree. For my brother Tommy, my first fan. Candy Preclass watched as the rich boy boarded the ship. He looked to be about 15, maybe even her own age of 16. He had already shocked her when she realized his only luggage was one trunk and the shoulder bag he carried. Okay, there was the large cat following him up the gangplank also. He was to be the only passenger this trip from Port Cutter, named for the boy's family, on the southeastern corner of the continent, to Forjod on the southwestern corner where he would be attending school. It made sense. The Forjod Consortium, normally just referred to as the Consortium, was the last major center of humanity on the eastern continent, and while the new colony of Mathan's Refuge and the surrounding settlements were growing quickly, Forjod was the only place left for a higher education. Unless you count the sea. The sea was all the education Candy needed. Well, that and what the tutor her father had hired for her had taught her. Her father was the captain of this merchant ship, and Candy had finally been made first mate. Their ship, the Cree, was owned by Cutter Stoneworks, which meant this boy was an owner even if he was adopted into the family. Jace Cutter was his name, and he wasn't at all what she had expected from such a privileged family. He stopped and cheerily talked a few moments to every person he passed, and in return each crew member seemed to brighten up and speak back. Only when he was on the ship and she could overhear him did she realize that he was learning where each crew member was from, and then talking about their homes in whatever language was spoken in their native country. The boy had to be fluent in at least 6 languages. Was he going to attend school or teach it? She continued to watch him as he made his way up to the helm, where she and her father were waiting. "Hello, I'm Jace Cutter. Are you the captain?" he asked enthusiastically, extending his hand. He was speaking Forian now, the language of the consortium where her father was from. "Yes," her father answered in Necromian, the official ship language. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Cutter." "Thank you for the passage," the boy returned with a bright smile. "Oh, and this is Misty," he added, indicating the large cat that had just flopped down and curled up on the boy's feet. Jace continued speaking. "This is my first time traveling by sea. Is there anything I need to know about the trip? How have the shipping lanes been since our treaty with the elves?" "They have been much better. The elvish navy has kept the pirates and slave traders away, and now we only have to deal with an occasional inspection from the elves. The shipping lanes have been the safest they have been for 100 years. Even as it is, we still have 16 long-range cannons and the best gunners on all the high seas, just in case." Jace nodded his satisfaction and finally looked over to Candy. "This is my daughter and first mate, Candy." They exchanged quick "how do you dos," and her father continued, "Candy will show you to your bunk." Taking the boy to his bunk proved to be a time-consuming chore, as Jace had to stop and introduce himself to everyone they passed. She had to admit, though, he seemed sincere in his desire to befriend the crew. It was as he was introducing himself to the ship's quartermaster that Candy noticed an odd object on the boy's hand. It looked like a bracelet connected to a webbing of leather strips and beads, and the other side of the webbing to 4 rings. The beads made the shape of a wolf. "What is that you're wearing on your hand?" she asked as soon as they had a moment to speak alone. Jace glanced down at his hand and answered, "It's a rusika. An old elvish fashion statement." "And you're trying to revive it?" Candy asked, grinning. "You could say that," Jace answered. "So you were named for the city you were born in?" "Excuse me?" Candy asked, raising an eyebrow. "I didn't mean anything, but your father's accent sounded like he was from the city of Kandi in the Forjod Consortium, as does yours." You could tell that even when we speak Necromian? Accents often carry over to secondary languages. I've always been good at hearing them, Jace said with a shrug as they reached his bunk. That is amazing, if not a little strange. This is your bunk here. The captain would like to invite you to eat with him tonight. We will be shoving off soon, and I will be needed on deck. With that, Candy turned around and headed back up. While she found the new boy kind of strange, the crew seemed to fall immediately in love with him. She had to admit he was extremely charming, but often when she found him alone he often had a withdrawn expression, almost brooding, that would disappear the moment he realized he was being watched, which brought up the other weird thing about Jace Cutter. The boy not only seemed to have eyes on the back of his head, he also had the eyesight of a hawk. He always knew immediately when someone was looking at him. It was as if he could feel people's gaze on him, and if he was on deck he saw things before the lookout in the crow's nest noticed every time. On the third week out, he was the first to see the elvish ships. There were 4 of them, 3 smaller corsairs and a larger frigate. The 3 corsairs spread out around the Cree as the frigate moved to intercept. Order gunners to make cannons ready but leave the gun ports closed, Captain Preclass ordered. Do you expect trouble? Jace asked. No, but always best to be prepared. While the elves have never been more than an inconvenience with their blockades, they have always honored the treaty. They will inspect us to ensure we are not smuggling weapons, and will then let us pass. It took the elvish ship little time to dock with the Cree, and quickly a small group of elves were on board, and their leader addressed the captain. What is your cargo? Our normal cargo of stoneworks and 1 passenger, young Mr. Cutter here, the captain responded, indicating to Jace. A surprised look came over the elf's face and he asked, Jace Cutter? Jace answered him, at least Candy thought he did. Jace spoke a quick word in Elvish that she assumed was the answer and then spoke some more. Candy was wondering if there was a language Jace wasn't fluent in, when the elf responded to whatever Jace had said with a smile and laughter. In fact, all the elves were chuckling. Candy didn't even know elves could laugh, at least she had never seen one do so. How did he do it? 2 sentences and even the not-so-friendly elves adored him. The inspection took half the time they normally took. Whatever Jace had said put them in a good mood, and after giving a quick glance at the Cree's hold they left the ship, after having one more pleasant conversation with Jace. What did you guys talk about? Candy asked as soon as they were out of earshot. He told us there was 1 more squadron of ships we might run into in another week or so. But it shouldn't be a problem since he saw no issues here. No, what did you say to put them in such a good mood? Candy clarified. Oh, that, I just asked him about his family. His brother is a merchant who has had some dealings with us before. He was like his brother, loves to talk about his family, Jace answered with a smile. It was early in the morning 9 days later that they came in sight of the second group of elvish ships. Once again there were 3 corsairs and the frigate, and as before the corsairs began to fan out to encircle the Cree as soon as they saw them. Just as before, gunners, make your cannons ready but leave gun ports closed, the captain ordered before turning to Candy. Go ask Mr. Cutter if he would like to join us up here. Candy hoped that Jace would make this inspection go as well as the last. She knocked and when Jace asked who it was she answered, It's Candy, we are approaching another elvish blockade and the captain would like you on deck. The cabin door opened and Jace came out with his customary smile. Well, we shouldn't keep them waiting, let's go. As they walked, Candy noticed his feline shadow was nowhere to be seen. No kitty today? Misty is down in the holds, looking for something to stock. Good luck to her, she solved our rat problem our first week out, Candy said. As they came out on deck, Jace started to say, she does have a thing for, but suddenly stopped, and she saw him tense up out of the corner of her eye. Before she could even begin to ask him what was wrong, Jace grabbed her wrist and yelled, Look out! There was a tremendous sound she recognized as an explosion, and in the same instant she was surrounded by flames. Oddly, her very first thought was to wonder why she couldn't feel any heat. Before she could even begin to process what was happening, the flames suddenly began to rush by her, and in a moment were gone. She found herself standing on a now blackened deck with Jace still standing next to her holding her wrist with one hand, and with his other hand, the one with the Rusika on it, there was a small ball of flames hovering just above the palm of his hand, which was extended in front of him. He raised his hand above his head, and several small balls of flames sped off in different directions, and immediately large explosions filled the air around the Cree. "What's going?" Candy started to ask, but Jace interrupted. "I blocked the rest of their opening volley. They are reloading all their ballista now." The captain. She saw her father on the ground near the helm of the ship. Her heart sank when she saw him. He had bad burns all over and was bleeding badly from the neck. Candy stepped up to the helm and yelled down the pipe used to communicate to the lower decks, "Ship's doctor to the helm." Meanwhile, Jace knelt next to the captain, looked him up and down, and stuck his thumb into the bleeding hole in her father's neck. "What are you doing?" Candy cried out. "Keeping him from bleeding to death before the doctor arrives," Jace answered in a calm voice that startled her. Then looking up at her he continued, "I'll keep him alive. You need to command this ship before they finish reloading. Now." He was right. With her father down, she was in charge, and the Elvish ships would be ready to fire again in moments. She glanced at the positions of the attacking ships. The 3 corsairs were surrounding the Cree as the frigate kept back. As if sensing the question she was about to ask, Jace called out loud, "They aren't elves, they're human pirates. They must have hijacked the Elvish ships somehow." So that's what happened. Pirates captured the Elvish ships and were using them to lure in unsuspecting ships. Well, not for any longer if Candy had any say. She grabbed the helm and lined up towards the ship off her port bow. A glance at the sails told her while they were burned on the edges a little, they had been spared any serious damage. She piped down to the gunnery deck, "Port side cannons ready to fire on my command." The corsairs began to fire another volley, but Candy had anticipated it, and had already turned the helm to take evasive action. One of the enemy ships behind them was already out of range, and their shots landed in the water just behind them. The ones from the ship they were heading towards were better aimed, but exploded in the air, as if they had hit an invisible wall. She noticed Jace had his free hand extended towards them. Candy hadn't seen any fireballs this time, however, and she heard Jace grunt from pain, as if he had felt the blow that time. She just couldn't figure out this boy. She had never known a human able to use so much magic without a lot of preparation. Jace turned towards the 3rd ship but was too late. One of its shots hit the Cree low on the starboard side, but immediately the ensuing ball of flames seemed to be sucked in a burning stream right into Jace's hand. She didn't know how he was controlling those flames but was glad he was. Those fires on her wooden ship would have been the end for them. The pirates were reloading again, but she didn't plan to give them any more shots. She held her course and her port guns were now lining up with the nearest corsair. She knew her gunners, and when the time was right, she shouted the order to fire. 8 cannons sounded, and she watched as one ballista exploded along with its ammunition, splashing the explosive oil they used in their shots across the deck, which immediately caught fire. The ship's masts were also cut down by the Cree's cannons, and the sails dropped into the growing flames. In moments the entire deck of the ship was one huge bonfire, and these flames were not sucked away. As she ordered her gunners to reload the port guns, Candy kept the Cree in as sharp of a turn around the doomed ship as she could, quickly putting the burning corsair between her and the other 2 ships. She glanced over to her father and saw the ship's doctor was now working on him, as Jace had moved to help other injured crew. The fear and anxiety she felt for her father's well-being almost made her leave her post, but she knew everyone on the ship, including her father, were counting on her. A crew member ran up to her and reported, that last hit was below the waterline. We're taking on water quickly, I don't think we can outrun them, as we are. Candy scowled at the young seaman and retorted, who said we were running? Instead of turning the ship to open water, she continued to circle the flaming wreck. The flames were so high that it was impossible to see over them, so much the better for the Cree. Candy straightened out as soon as she spotted a corsair coming around in the opposite direction. Her plan had worked. They had positioned themselves to chase down a fleeing victim and didn't realize their mistake till the Cree was already beginning to cross right in front of them in a perfect crossing the T maneuver. Port guns fire as you have a shot. Candy called out. The Cree's gunners opened fire with the same expert and deadly aim that had destroyed the first corsair, and with equal results. Leaving 2 bonfires on the ocean, Candy now turned to ship on a wide arch to starboard and ordered her gunners to load and man the starboard guns. Already, the third corsair was coming into view, retracing the Cree's path around the first burning ship. They also seemed to have been expecting that they would be chasing a fleeing ship, and now found itself watching as the Cree made a slow arc around them with its 8 starboard cannons aimed right at them. They immediately turned to take evasive action and fired its forward ballista, but they were not in range. The Cree's cannons, however, were. Candy ordered her guns to fire, but due to the range, her guns didn't have quite as good aim as the first 2 times. Instead of 1 broadside, it took 3 to set her ablaze. You would think they would keep their ammunition secured better, Candy wondered to herself, as she continued her starboard arc back towards the pirates' frigate that had so far avoided the fighting. Had they been elvish sailors they would have, Jace said, stepping up beside her, and quickly added, your father will be fine. Miraculously, it seems none of the crew were killed, just burns and lacerations. Relief flooded through Candy and her voice cracked a little as she said, I think the miracle's name is Jace Cutter. How did you do all that, and how come we weren't burned like the rest? Jace just shrugged at the compliment and then raised his hand and said, this Rusika isn't a fashion statement, it is magic. It protects me and anyone I'm touching from fire and heat. And power to control fire? Candy asked, remembering how he sucked the flames to his hand and sent out fireballs to stop the first wave of ballista shots. Yes. Are you going after the frigate? Jace asked, before Candy could question him about the magic wall he had somehow put up. Yes, she answered, her eyes narrowing as the ship came into view. You can't destroy it like you did the others, Jace stated in a matter-of-fact tone. Why not? Because the Cree is sinking, and that frigate is now the only ship nearby that isn't. It was true, the controls were sluggish and the ship was listing to starboard. The hole that had been reported to her was worse than she had first suspected. Also, Jace continued, these pirates are slave traders. That frigate stayed away from the fighting because they didn't want to risk losing their cargo. Slaves? It's a slave ship? Candy asked, and then before he could answer also asked, how do you know? I recognize their captain. He was part of the slave trade in Aguaras, where I was an orphan. He was a tracker who marked us to make sure we couldn't escape. He tracked me nearly all the way to Valen once. That was right. She remembered hearing he had been adopted into the Cutter family after it had been found out his orphanage was ran by slave traders. All Marines on deck and anyone that can fire a gun. Candy ordered. Taking out her spyglass, she saw the frigate's captain also ordering armed men into a firing line. Meanwhile, their ballista were ready to fire at them as soon as they came into range, which would be in a few moments. If they did manage to get close enough to board, they were highly outnumbered. Suddenly the frigate's captain turned and seemed to be staring right at her with a look of shock on his face. Well, that took him by surprise, Jace chuckled. What? What did you do? The magic mark he put on me is still there. I learned to block it years ago. I just unblocked it and he just realized I'm here. Wait, no you don't. He is trying to cancel his mark, but it's too late. The connection is mine now. Listen, we have to hurry. I'll go secure their deck, and once I do, I'll open a magic gate next to Misty. Get all your crew through it, Marines first. Candy turned to face Jace to ask him what in Moondial's green world he was talking about, but she only got a glimpse of him vanishing in a bright light. Sitting on the ground next to where he had been was his cat, soaked from head to tail and looking highly annoyed by it. Murmurs of astonishment swept through the crew members that had been watching, but were cut short by the sound of gunfire from the other ship. Quickly bringing her spyglass back to her eye, Candy looked in amazement at what was happening on the deck of the frigate. Jace was on the deck of the slaver's ship near its captain, and the crew were firing their firearms at him, some from only a few feet away. Jace didn't even appear to care, and with reason, he seemed to be completely untouched by the hail of bullets. After a few seconds the gunfire stopped, and Jace extended his arms out and raised them a little. Suddenly every crew member on the frigate's deck seemed to levitate a couple of feet into the air. Then a pillar of light appeared next to Jace, and looking back to Misty, after seeing a light out of the corner of her eye, saw an identical pillar next to her. At this point she was done being surprised. She called out, "Marines with me first, then able-bodied crew help the injured through. Doctor, be sure everyone gets off." Then without hesitation she stepped into the light. She came out on the pirate's frigate. The crew were all suspended above the ground in what she now could see was a sphere of dim light. Jace stood there with sweat pouring down his face, with a look of deep concentration on his face. Candy wasn't surprised that the boy's magic use was showing so heavily on him. Just the magic for the gate was supposed to take more magic than humans could channel, for a magic gate, and to magically imprison the whole crew of the frigate all together? "I'll start releasing them one at a time. Please disarm and secure them. Also send men to secure their prisoners below. There might be a few crew hiding down there," Jace said with some difficulty. Candy sent half her Marines below decks to secure the rest of the ship. Then Jace released the pirate's captain, who, when the sphere of light vanished, fell hard to the ground, giving a loud groan of pain. Was that a grin that flashed across Jace's face? The Marines hauled him to his feet, and the man glared at Jace. As the men secured more crew members, Candy addressed the captain of the slave traders. "You attacked my ship and nearly killed my father. Why shouldn't I have you shot right now?" Never taking his glare off Jace, the man said, "If you had any wisdom you would shoot that boy now. You don't know what he is, but I do. If you don't kill him now, he will destroy everything. He will destroy you all." He was becoming hysterical, and Candy ordered him to be taken away. She glanced at Jace and wondered just what was she dealing with. The doctor came through with the last of the crew, as the Marines continued to secure the pirates. Misty was the last one through the gate, and it vanished as the cat ran down the nearest hatch. "Where is she going?" one of the crew asked. Jace answered, obviously under far less strain now. "She finally has something real to hunt again. She went to stalk some prey." "Is that safe?" Candy asked. Jace shrugged. "She knows better than to kill anyone." Candy shook her head and walked to the doctor. She could finally see to the one thing that had been on her mind since the first shot was fired. "How is my father?" she asked. "Impossibly well," the doctor responded. Candy stopped, confused. What do you mean?" "Come look," he ordered. He led her to the unconscious captain, and where she expected to see the horribly burned man she had seen before, she instead saw a man with no burns and only a few bandaged cuts. Even his terrible neck wound had been left unbandaged and only had a small scab on it. "What did you do?" "Nothing," replied the doctor. "Aside from the few bandages I put on him, this is how I found him. I looked on the other injured crew, and found them in similar if not better conditions." Candy started to ask how but stopped. The answer was obvious. She looked around for Jace but didn't see him. He had finished releasing the pirates to Marine custody, and had left. She found him below decks. She passed the Marines securing one last pirate, this one covered with deep claw and teeth marks, and approached Jace, watching as the crew began releasing some very grateful prisoners. "You healed my father," she stated. "And the crew," Jace nodded, never even glancing her way. "You could have handled the pirates all by yourself, you didn't even need us." "Correct, I didn't need you, but your crew needed you." "It's true, I could have taken out the pirates all by myself, and as I did, your father would have bled to death and most of your crew would have burned alive," Jace answered, and then finally looking her way and staring right into her eyes continued, "You saved your crew, you took command, and those corsairs never knew what hit them." Before Candy could respond to that, Jace faced the prisoners being released and said, "We have a problem." Candy turned red in fury. He was changing the subject. "What do you notice about these prisoners?" Jace asked. Candy grudgingly looked. She saw elvish sailors, original crew for certain, also merchants from several human nations of the western continent, and even some sailors she recognized being from Cutter's Stoneworks. "Who isn't represented here?" Jace asked. Candy thought for a moment, and then it hit her. There isn't anyone from the Forjod Consortium here. Here they are on the Consortium's very doorstep, and didn't take a single Consortium ship. They weren't pirates, they were privateers. You think Forjod is funding them? No, not Forjod itself, but I think someone on the council is profiting from the loss of ships from competing merchants. How else could they have taken an elvish blockade? But that doesn't matter now. Candy finished his thought, because once the elves figure it out, the ceasefire will be over. Well, so much for school? Candy raised her eyebrow and Jace continued, I'd rather not be going to school in Forjod when the elves burn it to the ground like they did Valen. Next few years should be interesting. Jace, what are you? Candy finally asked. The boy shrugged and said, not sure yet, either something really good for this world or something really bad. He turned to face Candy again and winked. Also by Mark Van Pelt. Excerpt from Lich El, The Lich Lord Wars Book 1. Almaz sat up and looked in the direction from which the arrow had come. Coming out of the woods was a man armed with a bow and the Aguarius crest on his tunic. It was one of his father's scouts, but something was wrong. Even from this distance he could tell his skin was pale and dry. He could also see running up both arms what looked like spikes. The most eerie thing was his face. It was completely emotionless, blank, like there weren't any thoughts or feelings behind eyes that appeared devoid of life. All those years of his father telling stories of battles against the undead could never have prepared Almaz for meeting his first revenant. Revenants were completely lifeless, which meant there was a Lich Lord in the forest controlling it, and most likely more of them. This one was reloading his bow, and Almaz was just sitting there, completely unable to will his body to move from fear. The Revenant pulled back the arrow, and Almaz was hit hard with the realization that he was about to die. Mathan's Flight. Fate's Foe Series Book 1. Mathan is a successful businessman, thanks in no small part to a magical crest he wears around his neck that gives him glimpses into the future. His life is turned upside down when one of these glimpses shows him someone destined to become the worst and most evil tyrant the world will ever know, and shows him this person in the form of a small 8-year-old boy who just attempted to pick his pocket. Acknowledgements. This was a story I had going on in my head for a while. When a friend my brother and I played online games with agreed to let me use her screen name for my main character, I decided to go ahead and write it. Thanks, Candy. About the author. Growing up in Bay Point, California, Mark spent much of his time creating and exploring worlds and stories. He finally realized that once he got the stories written down, they stopped haunting his sleeping and waking dreams. So he started writing them down. He writes the kind of stories that he enjoys, which are stories about families, written for families. Mark currently lives in northern Utah with his wife and kids.